All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to start with addressing how question and answers will be handled. General Rand will give his presentation, and then after that, we'll have a question and answer portion. You can submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen in written form, or when the question and answer session starts, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can speak your question out loud. I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to BPRP Tomas Diaz de la Rivia.
Thank you, Michelle. And good morning, good afternoon for those of you on the Central and East Coast times, and good morning to those of you in the Mountain and Pacific times. I saw some friends joining in from different parts of the country. So welcome everybody, great to have everybody here for our next today's research distinguished lecture, which will be presented by my great friend and colleague and mentor, General Robin Baba Rand. You know, I'm sure that many of you, all of you have seen the biography, have had an opportunity to look at the history of service to the nation of General Rand. I have just to tell you that personally, you know, he is just an outstanding individual, outstanding leader that has served our nation with incredible distinction. His career is full of accolades, but also full of heroic acts of service to others and to all of us. We all owe him a great debt of gratitude. I've had the fortune of knowing General Rand for a few years now, and having worked with him on a couple of projects, got to learn a lot from his leadership, and he's been a great mentor to me during this time. So thank you so much for that, sir. And with that brief introduction, I'll let you, you know, tell us about your views and your experiences over the last 40 years, over your distinguished career with the Air Force, and
well, thank you, Tomas.
Those leadership lessons can be applied today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I wish I was with you in person. We kind of were going to do that, and then, you know, everyone has to be flexible this year, don't we? In the Air Force, we said flexibility is the key to air superiority. So, Michelle, if you'd go ahead and put up that first slide, and I'll just kind of share with you what I'm thinking about. And Tomas and I talked a little bit beforehand, and I really encourage questions, okay? Because I think that'll be better. But I'm not gifted. I'm not an expert in much. I just kind of realized, though, that as I reflected back, and Tomas said, talk about national security. And I go, well, maybe we can just do a walk down memory lane from when I first came in as a young 18-year-old until today. I retired 2 years ago in August. So I'm not as current as I would have been, but I try to stay abreast of things. But it's just fascinating as I look back on my career, the changes that happened in that 40-year period of time, 44-year period of time. That picture there is kind of not a bookend, but kind of the end of, as I was getting ready to leave. It was taken in Minot, North Dakota by a B-52 back in February of 2018. It was probably about 34 degrees below zero that morning. And it was quite cold. And then the picture next to it was with two of our security forces that were on the missile fields of North Dakota. And I was a speaker at their annual awards banquet. So let's go to the next slide. And I'll kind of share with you what I thought we could talk about today.
Working on that, General Rand, just 1 second.
Okay. So what I kind of thought, I just, again, as we go through, is when I first came in the 70s, and what I thought maybe the impact of the Nixon resignation and how that affected, and I said cold car, it's supposed to be Cold War, excuse me. I'm a Cold Warrior. I came into the Air Force right smack in the middle of that. I served then from there into the 80s. I was there at the fall of the wall there in 1989 when that happened, and we called it the peace dividend. It's debatable whether we really enjoyed that or not. certainly the 1990s, what was the impact of Desert Storm, not only on us, but on our potential adversaries, particularly Russia and China. And then what we call the new millennium. And boy, did the 21st century bring some changes to how we do business, and the impact that has had through that sequestration that we experienced and we still haven't really recovered from in 2013 into where we are today, where we have these resurgent peers, particularly with China and Russia and what we're seeing in North Korea. So I just thought I'd share some of these things, and then we can go question and answers. And again, I'll tell you what I'm sharing. A lot of it is going to be my opinion and my thoughts, but and facts as I remember them. So next slide. You know, gang, I was a little bit about me, and not the other than just so you understand the perspective of where I was and what I was doing in those 40 years. I'm the son of a World War II, Korea, Vietnam fighter pilot. My dad fought in 3 wars. I was a military dependent my entire life. We traveled around. I was able to settle down in Colorado Springs for my high school years. And then I immediately went to the prep school at the United States Air Force Academy, and then got an appointment and went up to the academy for 4 years. Both my brothers were Marines, and both of them and my dad all served together, or at the same time at least, in Vietnam from 66 to 60, late 67, early 68. God bless my mom having 3, her husband and two of her sons in combat. As I was telling you though, in 1974, I wasn't smart enough to get a direct appointment to the academy, so I had to go to the preparatory school. And I was at the prep school going through basic military training when President Nixon resigned, August 9th, 1974. So where were you on that day? We'll talk about the impact that I think that had, particularly on detente and in the Cold War. And as I said, after I graduated from the academy, I was a cold warrior. That's how I'll just call it. I went to pilot training after I graduated in 1979. And in that period of time, from 1979 to 1992, I spent most of my time as a F-16 pilot. I served in Europe. I left Spain, where we were sitting nuclear alert in a place called Adana, Incirlik Air Base, Turkey, in Aviano, Italy. And we actually had F-16s with B-61 nuclear bombs on them. And we sat what was called a Victor alert. It was a 15-minute from when the klaxon sounded to you having to be able to be airborne. And we'll never forget those days of the stark terror every time the klaxon would sound and you're running out to your airplane and going, is this a practice scramble or is this the real deal? Interesting to note, later in my career, when I was testifying as a 4-star, as the Air Force commander of Air Force Global Strike Command, I had a congressman challenge me about my qualifications to be the commander of the command that was responsible for 2 legs of the triad, the bomber airborne leg and the intercontinental ballistic leg. And I said, well, sir, with all due respect, you haven't looked at my bio. I'm probably the last remaining airman in the Air Force who can say he actually sat nuclear alert with a real nuclear weapon on it. And that kind of silenced him for a little while, at least. From there, I ended up being what's called an air liaison officer, and with 7th Corps in Germany. I was assigned with the Army. Back in the mid 80s, we had 2 corps, 5th Corps and 7th Corps. A lot of soldiers and airmen in Europe back then. If you look at the statistics, we had over 320,000 troops assigned in Europe in the mid 80s. And we were thinking, as you've all heard the term, the Fulda Gap. Okay, that's where we're going to fight. And I was in 7th Corps. I wasn't responsible for the Fulda. We were on the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia border. And that was quite an experience as we prepared if the Soviet Union ever decided to come west. From there, I left that job and I got back into the flying business, and I went to Japan. And when I was in Japan is when the wall came down, and I had just left Germany. And in fact, I had been to Berlin many times, and I never thought in my lifetime in the 80s, mid 80s, that I would ever see that wall come down. It wasn't in my mindset. And, we can talk about that. Nothing short of miraculous how it did come down so quickly and suddenly. In the 1990s, Desert Storm happened, and things changed a little bit. I was a fighter squadron commander in the Republic of Korea. I was there when the dictator Kim Il-sung died. That was an interesting time, and North Korea was just doing their nuclear startup. And I remember that President Clinton at the time was trying to put sanctions against them. Obviously, it didn't work, did it? Because here we are now 25 years later, and we're still concerned about that. After I finished my tours in Korea, I went to the Naval War College, and then I was assigned as a Joint Staff Action Officer. And the primary job I had there was to work with the NATO on their nuclear alliance. These were non-nuclear, non-strategic. We call them tactical nuclear, again, on the F-16s and in those countries. And it was a fascinating time to be in that business, to watch as the wall had come down and NATO was expanding and Russians became our friends, and to be with what were former Soviet Union countries. Now we're at the table with us, and it was just, unbelievable. It's something I never would have thought that I would ever have experienced. After I finished my time in the Pentagon, that first tour, I started into some what I call senior level operational and training commands and staff. I became a colonel, and then I went on to my general officer tours. I was blessed that I got to do a lot of commands, and obviously that's a privilege and an honor. And I was the Air Force Weapons School commandant. I went back to Korea and I commanded a fighter wing in Korea at Kunsan Air Base. I went from there back to Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix, Arizona. We had 206 F-16s on the ramp there. It was amazing wing. And from there, I went over to Balad Air Base, Iraq, and did a 13-month combat tour as a wing commander, the 332nd Air Expeditionary Wing. Infamous for having been we carried the banner and the flag of the Tuskegee Airmen, the original 332nd Fighter Group led by then Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., an all African American when we were a segregated military. I also was fortunate enough, as I rose through the ranks of general officership, to be the air component to Southcom. So I spent a lot of time in Central and South America. Sadly, gang, a place we've taken our eye off the ball in our own backyard. We're not being very good stewards. We focus so much on certainly the global war on terror in the Middle East, and certainly the resurgence of what's going on with China and Russia. But in our own backyard, there's some real challenges there, and I have nothing but love and fondness for our allies in Central and South America, but there's a vacuum there in a lot of those countries in terms of governance and economy and security, and it's frankly a little unsettling. When I was the commander of what was called AF South, this was back in 2011 to 2013, we were averaging about 35,000 deaths a year due to drug overdoses. And it didn't seem to bother anyone. where were those drugs coming from? I also had the opportunity, as I finished my combat tour in Iraq, to come back as a 1-star and work in the Office of Secretary of Defense on the Middle East portfolio. And certainly that was in 2007 to 2009, as we were getting very serious about trying to have a honorable withdrawal from Iraq, and we were still very engaged in Afghanistan. I got a lot of firsthand, though, experience working with the Israelis in all the Middle East countries. And so, wow, talk about, it's an easy problem to describe what's going on in the Middle East, a really hard problem to solve. As a 2-star general, I was able to do something that, again, this experience of just being this like 9th grade civics course. I was the Air Force Legislative Liaison Director. And so I got to know our 500 plus friends on Capitol Hill in working with both the House side and the Senate side. And as the LL director, as we called it, very fortunate to be able to spend time. Anytime the Secretary of the Air Force or the Chief of Staff of the Air Force had to go to the Hill and testify or meet with members of Congress and their staffs, I normally led the way and either prepped for it, or I was always able to be in the room with them. And again, talk about watching how one of the 3 branches of government works. It's such a up close and personal. We have obviously the executive branch, we have the legislative, and we have the judicial. And I got a firsthand view of how our legislation works. And whew, wow, something. I commanded, after I went and left Tucson, Arizona as AF South, I got my 4th star. And I went back to the training business in San Antonio, Texas, where we're responsible for all of our accessions training for our young airmen coming in, for all our undergraduate aviation training, for our technical training, our air university. All that was part of Air Education Training Command. And, I started my career in 1979 in pilot training, and I thought that's where I was going to end my career. And lo and behold, 2 years in that assignment, I got tapped on the shoulder by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And he said, I need you to go to Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport, Louisiana. When I went home and told my wife, Kim, we're going to Barksdale, she looked at me and she said, where's Barksdale at? Because we were fighter pilots, and I had never really spent any time in that strategic business. And so that was Air Force Global Strike Command, formerly known as Strategic Air Command. And I was able to spend my last 3 years in the Air Force as the component commander to STRATCOM. And again, I watched our national defense strategy pivot. I was deeply rooted in the nuclear modernization that was going on. And as well as with our bombers, we on any given day provided daily support to 7 combatant commanders. The commander in Europe, the commander in the Pacific, the commander in Africa, the commander in obviously STRATCOM, the Southcom commander. It was fascinating job, and it was such a privilege to finish up a 40-year career in Air Force Global Strike. So that's a little bit about me. So now let's go into kind of how I saw national security. Next. Well, gang, so here we were in the 1970s, and there's a myth out there that while it wasn't pretty and there were some tactical failures, actually militarily, we achieved our objective in Vietnam. When the Paris peace talks were signed in January 1973, the North Vietnamese went back north of the border. Their entire military. They failed. Their military objectives failed. They wanted to take control of South Vietnam, and they went back. And there are some very strict things that were going to happen if they ever came south again. First, we were going to provide South Vietnam with $1.4 billion in aid. And we also were going to, if they ever came, do to them what happened in December of 1972 with Linebacker 2. So militarily, our objective was reached. And if you remember in 1972, President Nixon went to China. Do you all remember that visit? You familiar with that? And at that time, before that, there was really a two-power Cold War. In his visit to China actually had a very chilling effect on the Soviet Union because it became a three-power triangular diplomacy. And as you know, China is the underbelly to Russia. And instead of it being an East-West face-off, the Soviet Union became more concerned with what was going on in China. And so this detente was very, very successful. But what happened? Watergate. And the impact of Watergate cannot be overstated. When President Nixon had to resign, and then he was pardoned. And because of his pardon and the national loss of confidence, which by the way, proved probably was a very courageous act by President Ford. But both the House and the Senate were Democratic controlled. And we were really wallowing. We had lost our edge, and the Soviet Union took great advantage of that. And there were several things that happened. Watergate's one of them. Then we saw the if you guys remember the oil crisis, the OPEC crisis, the United States was lagging, our infrastructure is behind. We kind of had lost our way. And through the 70s under President Carter, a lot of bad things. When the South or North Vietnamese came south in April 1975, we didn't give them the promised aid of $1.4 billion. We gave them half of that. It's kind of like throwing a rope out to someone who's drowning. If you only throw it halfway, you're not going to help them. There was no stomach to go back after into Hanoi and resume bombing. And consequently, by April of 1975, Saigon fell, was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in its history. That had a very chilling effect. In 1978, when unarmed students invaded or protested on our embassy in Tehran, we did nothing. And consequently, we had Americans held hostage for over 440 days. And then the fiasco and the disaster of the Desert One in 1979, when we tried to go rescue those, and we ended up losing 5 helicopters and 2 EC-130s, and 7 Americans burned to death. The Russians were watching all this, and they said, wow, they are tigers now without teeth. And so they became very emboldened. And it was risky, boy. And at the same time, we became an all-volunteer force, and we also became a hollow force. The budgets were way down. We were coming out of the withdrawals of the Vietnam buildup. Our fighter pilots weren't flying. Our proficiency and our training wasn't up to par. Just a really, really tough time. But the one thing we maintained was our 24/7, 365 nuclear alert for all 3 legs of the triad. And in the Air Force, that was certainly the air leg and the intercontinental ballistic. So that's the Air Force I entered in 1979 as a young second lieutenant. When I say a large but hollow, let me give you a statistic. As I came in the Air Force as a second lieutenant, we were a tad under 700,000 active duty airmen. Hold on to that thought. When I retired in 2018, we were a tad under 320,000 airmen, less than half the size. Next. So I entered the Air Force in 1979, and then we go into the 80s. And we got a president named Ronald Reagan. And the first thing out the chute he did was said, I'm going to build our military back up. And boy, oh boy, did he. Boy, oh boy, did he. He brought back the B-1 that Carter shelved in the 70s. We modernized with our F-16s, F-15s, A-10s, set the stage for what was going to be the force that so convincingly defeated Saddam Hussein in 1991. President Reagan had some goals. In the Air Force, he wanted to build the Air Force to 40 fighter wings, which is amazing number. You know, in 1981, if you remember, shortly after he took the presidency, everyone remember a thing called PATCO, when our air traffic controllers went sick, all but like of the 11,000 air traffic controllers, only 1,200 showed up. He said, you have 48 hours or I'm firing all of you. Everyone said, no, you can't do that. That would crush the economy. I think what it would do to air travel. Guess what he did 48 hours later? He fired them. And we put military controllers in our airports and our towers and civilian air traffic control. And somehow we went through it. I was an instructor pilot then. It was amazing how we trained to think about it. But it sent a message. This guy meant, and gang, we can go through it, but I was a cold warrior. I told you, I sat on the border of Germany and the Czech Republic. It was called our General Defense Plan. We were there with the army in case the Soviet Union decided to come west. We used to kiddingly say a MiG at 6 is better than no MiG at all. The enemy was the Soviet Union. That was our military's focus. We were prepared for this great square off between East and West, the Soviet Union and the United States. And lo and behold, in a period of 19 months, after 3 general secretaries died consecutively, starting with Brezhnev, a guy by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev came in. And him and Reagan, along with the support of Margaret Thatcher, came real close to setting an agreement that would have taken the nuclear weapons down by about 75%. Reykjavik, it didn't happen. Reagan held up his fingers and said, we were this close to making it happen. But if you all remember his famous speech when he said, Mr. Gorbachev, bring down that wall. And what happened? After President Bush replaced President Reagan, the wall came down. Gorbachev ended up resigning, but the Soviet Union disbanded. And the Cold War ended, and we won. But there were hints of other things going on, of discontent. And I don't know if you remember, but they were largely ignored. The Beirut barracks bombing, October of 1983, we lost 240 Marines. Gang, I was at Incirlik Air Base, Turkey, when the TWA Flight 847 hijacking, and we threw a United States sailor, the hijackers, on the tarmac at Beirut International. That happened June of 1985. I was there with 2 fighter squadrons. We were doing our what was called a NATO tactical evaluation. We ended it. We did very well. We were all celebrating. The wing commander came to this picnic we were having, and he said, hey, we're supposed to be going back to Torrejon, Spain after 8 weeks here, but not so fast. We're going to stay because we were literally a 15-minute flight from Incirlik to Beirut in our F-16s. And I was, for the first time in my life, that I was going to drop bombs in anger, because it was on the table that we were going to go retaliate against someone for this hijacking. Well, we didn't. But if you remember, in Berlin disco bombing in April of 1986, President Reagan said, I've had enough. And that's when he did El Dorado Canyon with F-111s in Libya, in the Tripoli. And we actually kinetically dropped against the Libyans. But, you know, I don't think we really were paying that much attention. We were still in the Cold War. We still were dealing with other areas. So the 80s kind of came and went. The wall came down. We go, peace in our time. We're going to drink vodka and we're all going to be friends. Next. Not so fast. In August of 1990, Saddam Hussein and his forces invaded Kuwait. And the impact of Desert Storm, I just want to share with you, for us was a stunning victory. Militarily, it was stunning. 45 days, we achieved every objective. Tactically, it could not have gone better. It was so stunning that it shocked the Russians and the Chinese. And they went, wow. And little did we know, they paid attention. And they began their modernization and remodernization of their militaries based on the stunning success. And we did just the opposite. The perceived peace dividend. Here's how we celebrated it. There were major DoD reductions and reorganizations. We stood down our airborne leg of nuclear alert. We actually disbanded Strategic Air Command that had been in place since 1948. And we moved those assets, the bombers and the ICBMs, to another command. The F-22 buy was cut by a third, then a half. What was supposed to be 500 to 800 F-22s ended up with the final buy of being 186. We really shifted away from our strategic deterrence, that existential threat that, or capability that we always had. And instead, we focused on becoming, whether we wanted to or not, the world peacekeeper. That's what our military's focus became. After Desert Storm, we had to enforce the no-fly zones and what we called Operation Northern Watch and Southern Watch. We went into Somalia, not very successfully. We actually got engaged in Kosovo and the Balkans. And we stayed in Iraq, flying countless hours every day. The United States Air Force was flying combat missions from 1991 that still have not stopped. Still have not stopped now, 30 years later. But there were still signs of this Islamic Caliphate. 1993 in Somalia, Black Hawk Down, the Trade Center bombing in 1993, the Khobar Tower bombing in 1996, the Sudan embassy bombing in 1998, and I didn't put on there the USS Cole in 2000. And guess what we were focused on? Not our near peers. Our expertise in China and Russian relations, our linguists, everything that we had been Soviet Union experts for 50, 60 years, all atrophied and went away. And our focus became on whack-a-mole, peacekeeping, okay, plinking bombs, trying to put out these little fires that were popping up. Next. And then the new millennium hit. And 9/11 happened. Where were you on 9/11? I know where I was. And that changed us. That was this generation's Pearl Harbor. And we are still engaged in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places, to include Africa, wherever we feel that these Islamic threats. And I'm not finding fault with that, okay? They have ill will towards us. Their lifestyle, true Islamic extremist lifestyles, incompatible with the United States, our way of life. But because we were also downgrading and shifting and dropping, as I said, think about it, what I said, 700,000, the most capable military in the world in 1991, and we started reducing forces. And the cost is we allowed our strategic deterrence to atrophy to the point of national disasters happen. Dumb things happened. We took a B-52 off in 2007 with a live nuclear weapon on it that the crew didn't even know. And it landed from Minot down to Barksdale, and it sat on the flight line for 24 hours before anyone realized. Our missile fields and our crews, morale was terrible, funding was terrible, facilities were terrible. And we had an old nuclear deterrence capability that had aged out. In the middle of this, doing all this peacekeeping and the global war on terror, we had an administration that thought it was appropriate to say, hey guys, go figure this out, how we can reduce our deficit by 2 trillion. But if you can't, then 50% of that's going to come out of the Defense Department, even though the Defense Department only makes up 20% of our budget. And the impact of sequestration in 2013 was almost crippling to our readiness and our capabilities. And we're still digging out of that. I cannot begin to tell you the impact it had. And yet what was going on? The Russians and the Chinese were beating us to the punch, particularly in those domains called space and cyber. And for all these decades of superiority that we had, technological superiority, it started to shrink. And our adversaries started to catch up, again, Russia and China. But as Obama was leaving, he did like the previous 12 administrations. He confirmed the need for a nuclear triad. And he endorsed the long-range standoff weapon, a new submarine, the new ICBM, and funded and approved for the B-21 replacement for the B-2 nuclear bomber. And then when President Trump came on and our Secretary of Defense, Secretary Mattis, for the first time in many years, we finally had a national defense strategy that was not based on a budget, but was based on threats. And it said, we now have a near peer. Our focus needs to go back to China and Russia. So when I came in 1979, where was our focus? And I watched us walk away from that. But as I was leaving the Air Force 40 years later, where did our focus and where is it now? We still have all these other missions to do, again, with half the force we used to. We are still engaged 24/7 in just about every corner of the world. But we now recognize that our near peer threats of China and Russia, that is an existential threat. And so the need for modernization of our strategic assets can't be overstated. Next. And here's why. It's a tough world, gang. But look what's going on in the East and South China Sea. Look at what's happening in Iran and in Russia today. The picture in the lower left is some guys with in Central and South America, transnational organized crime. We're still having to deal with the Islamic extremists. That fight is only halfway over. We'll be fighting them for another 30 years. And yet we also have to deal each day with what's going on in a place that's very near and dear to my heart, in the Republic of Korea, with what North Korea is up to. That evil regime. It's an evil regime. Next. So that was kind of the walk, gang, that I took you. 1979, Cold War, Soviet Union, 2020, we got a resurgent China, very resurgent Russia, who have spent their hard-earned national treasury on their modernization of their strategic forces, particularly in the space, cyber, hypersonic areas. It's a tough neighborhood out there. The world's a tough place. Our greatest strength, though, isn't our B-2s. It's not our B-21s. It's not our tanks. It's not our submarines. The greatest strength this nation has in its terms of its military is the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and their families who stand watch for us, who stand in the gap every day. So with that, Tomas, I'll just kind of turn it over to the team and see if there's any questions, if that provoked any discussions or questions anyone has. So I think I have this Q&A thing that I can look at.
And we also have somebody raising their hand to ask their question in our end.
Okay, so I got, how have threats from foreign adversaries changed from the Cold War to now? And how these changes impact the role of civilians to support our military national defense? Great question, whoever asked that, thank you. So the threats have changed. Basically, as I said, we were ready for the superpower standoff between the Soviet Union tanks and you know, a tank v tank fight coming through the Fulda Gap. We didn't even have a term called space. We didn't have a space force. And back until 2 or 3 years before I retired, we couldn't talk about space in terms of offense or defense. Okay, space is a contested domain right now. So that's a major, major change. The ability to have hypersonic weapons that can come in at us very hard to defend against. And the cyber domain, the impact that would have on all of us. A bullet doesn't have to be shot, a bomb doesn't have to be dropped, a missile doesn't have to be fired. And yet cyber threats can shut down economies. Imagine if you can't go to the gas station and put your credit card in to fill your tank up. You can't go to an ATM and get cash. You can't go to the grocery store anymore because if the cyber was able to take control. Those are threats that I couldn't even have spelled cyber 10 years ago. Okay. The role it has on civilians is that, hey, don't take this peace dividend for granted. Okay. And certainly the role it has is on our defense industries, how we can do things faster, on time, on cost, as we try to keep up with our adversaries. What role have alliances played during the history of national security in geopolitical instability, and what roles will alliances play in the coming decades? That's a very good question. Certainly, you know, something that has stood the test of time for all its dysfunction and challenges. The NATO alliance has been one that has been very successful. Okay. And that will continue to play a very, very important role, particularly with this resurgence of Russia. Former foes are now our strong allies, whether it's Japan, and we look at what's happened in the Pacific. I can't overstate the importance of the Republic of Korea. In 1953, that country couldn't rub 2 pieces of wood together. And today it's one of the leading, it's a beacon of hope for the rest of the world, of a country that was able to pull itself up by the bootstraps. And they are a very stabilizing input. Australia, we have to rely. I don't think we'll ever fight again without a coalition. We're better when we go on with coalitions. The success of Desert Storm proved that. Despite our times and challenges and the longevity of being in Afghanistan, Iraq, we have never been there alone. We have always had some coalition, some alliance there. It will continue to be very, very, very important.
I'm going to go ahead and call on Helen. She's got her hand raised
Okay.
to ask a question, if you don't mind. I'm going to allow her to talk. Hi, Helen. You can go ahead and ask your question if you want to unmute yourself.
Okay. General, you said, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. You said several times that you were assigned to this and that position. What went into that? Did you apply, or did you have to have certain things marked up that you were noted for, or how did you get those positions?
Thank you, Helen. That's a good question. Yeah, you know, we're an all-volunteer force. I mentioned that. 1973, we disbanded the draft. And so I said, here's your volunteer statement. You volunteer to enter the Air Force, and then the first time you say, I do, that's your last time you volunteer for anything, okay? So you don't get to choose your assignments. That's the powers to be, that your superiors do that. It's to meet needs with capabilities, okay, and skill sets. And there's always requirements. And, you know, all the jobs I got were probably You know, I didn't become a squadron commander first time when you're leading about, at the time, 300, 400 people. I'd been in the Air Force 17 years by the time that happened. So you work your way up to these things, and it's what you've done before and your expertise and your knowledge and development and professional development, and you become qualified and trained and proficient and able to do those things. And then as you get into the senior levels, to the general officer, first of all, being selected for general officer probably has more to do with luck and good fortune than it has to do with skill. I would tell you, for every general officer, there's 10 or 15 or 20 people just as deserving, just as capable, which is a nice problem to have. We have more quality than we do positions. But it's a combination of matching your expertise, your background, your experience with the needs of whatever is open at the time. With the exception, as I told you, I got parachuted into my last assignment, and I mean that honestly. Air Force Global Strike had all our bombers, and it had our intercontinental ballistic missiles. It did the National Airborne Operations Center, the NAOC. I was not versed at all in that. I had been a career fighter pilot. I had some nuclear experience, but at the tactical level. But I'll just tell you the short story of my last assignment and how I got it. Strategic Air Command was disbanded after Desert Storm. In the middle 2000s, we realized we were making some blunders with our nuclear forces, national level blunders.
Oh.
And we realized that we had to pay for the sins of our past, and we never should have disbanded Strategic Air Command and take a command that was responsible to focus on the nuclear enterprise. So we brought it back in 2009, and we named it, instead of Strategic Air Command, we renamed it Air Force Global Strike Command. And we put the bombers and the intercontinental ballistic missiles and a lot of the nuclear command and control under one command, but we made it a 3-star command. In 2014, we had another fallout, and we had a major scandal at one of our missile bases in Malmstrom Air Force Base, Montana. And the chief of staff at the time said, I can't take this heat anymore. And he elected in 2015 to make the command a 4-star command. And he looked around and he said, I don't have anyone on the bench who's currently ready to be a 4-star from the Continental Ballistic Missiles or the bomber field. So he tapped me on the shoulder and he said, Rand, you're it. You're going to go stand up, be the first 4-star of Air Force Global Strike. So with the exception of that command, the rest I probably got because I had expertise and experience in those areas. But frankly, I walked in the Air Force Global Strike as very much the novice, and I had to do a lot of learning in a really quick period of time. Did I answer your question, Helen?
And how do you take the heat?
How do you take the heat? Well, you actually surround yourself with good people. You try not to have a lot of heat, but Harry Truman said it best, the buck stops here, you know, with me.
Yeah.
And I found that a good leader, a humble leader, deflects credit to others when things go well.
Right.
And when things are broke, that leader owns it and says, I'm responsible. And I'll either do my dangest to fix it or I'll get fired. You know, and I was blessed that I had good bosses and tolerant. And it was, let me tell you, there's nothing easy about commanding Air Force Global Strike. You know, on any given day, we're moving an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, from a missile silo back to the base. That convoy, if something goes wrong, guess who the first phone call is going to go to after I would have found out about it? To the President of the United States. Okay. And so there's very little room for error. And you know, when you're talking about nuclear weapons, the tolerance for buffoonery is very, very, very small. And, you know, you hope and pray and you train people and you enforce standards and you hold people accountable, but sometimes things go wrong, and when they do, you own it and you try to fix it. And if you can't, then people above you are going to decide if you should stay in the job or not. So thank you for the question, Helen. Someone's asked about emerging technologies. They're out there, national and global. Specifically, is anything you can say about the confluence of cyber technologies and nuclear weapons and the potential for left of launch cyber attacks to undermine strategic stability? That's a really good question, whoever asked it. People used to, when I came in the Air Force, this is one of these big changes. We talked about basically 3 domains, maybe 4. The air, land, and sea, and undersea. Those are the domains, right? Air, land, sea. In my last 10 years, the 2 domains that became the most challenging and most contested became the space domain and the cyber. And that's a tough one to wrap your head around, isn't it? And I would tell people, I go, you know what? If we don't have control of space and cyber, it doesn't matter if you give me the best new ICBMs in the world, the most sophisticated stealth bomber, it won't matter if we don't have command of the cyber and of the space. And so we are putting a lot of time and effort into that. Yes, there is a confluence of those. Last year, about 13 months ago, the Air Force, actually, the Department of Defense stood up Space Force. It's a separate service now under the Department of the Air Force. We have 2 services, the United States Air Force and the United States Space Force. Cyber is still under the control of the Air Force, but at the combatant commander level, we have a cyber command. That's how serious we are about this. Okay. Because if we don't have control of that, then we would be no way could we deter with our nuclear forces to deter potential adversaries from using their nuclear forces. So they are, it's like a glove, very much fitted together. Artificial intelligence, unmanned systems on international security and policy. Well, those are 2, again, very, we could spend the entire session on just talking about artificial intelligence and certainly unmanned. The Air Force walked away from the term unmanned, and this isn't pejorative, because there's nothing unmanned about any system that we employ. Our quote unmanned systems are called remote pilot vehicles. And it takes roughly, to launch one, takes about 50 to 75 people to do that. But certainly, I've watched from where we are at the tactical, which started out as very much as an intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance platform. We now have remotely piloted vehicles, unmanned systems that are kinetic in nature and are going towards the strategic realm, that can fly at high altitudes, that can be refuelable, that can deliver kinetics. It has a chilling effect on security. Interesting enough, domestic policy is lagging the fight. We do things internationally that we can't even do over our own bases. And that's an issue that we need to resolve, and I can talk more about that. I'll give you an example: protection of our missile fields and our nuclear assets. Because there are now unmanned drones that come in and fly over, and we don't know who they are, we don't know always what they're doing, that are flying over and collecting data and information, and potentially could do what? Try to do something kinetically. And we don't have provisions in the United States to be able to employ offensively to shoot those things down. Very interesting. I can go in depth about that. It used to keep me up at night when I was the Air Force Global Strike Commander. Anyone
another
else want
hand
to
up.
ask a question before I read it? Is there anyone with their hand
Yeah,
up?
we have another hand up from Justin. I'm going to call on him right now.
Sure.
Hey, sir. Good morning. Justin Boldenau.
Hi, how are you?
Justin, if
Justin?
you want to unmute
Hey,
yourself
Justin.
and ask your question.
What the heck are you doing out there, buddy?
I am the professor of aerospace studies at Detachment 675 at Oklahoma.
Well, hey, did I tell anything that was wrong? Justin can grade my homework. Him and I are battle buddies together, man. It's nice.
No, sir, you are 100% correct. My question is probably maybe a little more broad and a little more future thinking. As I'm leading the detachment here and preparing the next generation of Air Force leaders, what's the one piece of advice you would give to them that I could pass along?
That's a wonderful question, brother. And you know, I had the opportunity to come and talk to those fine cadets last one March, I think, was the date, right before this nonsense, you know, kind of grounded all of us. I've always said this: the first and most important thing, Justin, is to be really good at your job. Learn your job, become a subject matter expert in your job. It has to start there. And then the second thing is to treat people with dignity and respect and adhere to standards. And if you do those three things, you're going to be very successful in our Air Force. I try to keep it simple, stupid. You know, the KISS principle. Be good at your job, adhere to standards, treat people appropriately. And I think that the sky's the limit if you do those things. Does that help? Did I answer your question?
It sure does, sir, and it fits.
I could come up with a
in
long
well.
list. You need to study, you need to read, you need to be a student of history. There's a lot of things that go into that, but at the real quick, hard hitting things, become good at what you do, like you did. You didn't become the man you are and the leader you were. One day we just didn't pop you out. You worked your butt off as a lieutenant and a captain and major, and it resulted in you commanding at the 06 level and now leading this detachment. So back to Helen's question, you know, how do you get jobs? You earn them, right?
Yes, sir.
You earn them. Anyone else have a question before I answer one of these? I got an interesting one. Given the impact experience you had with legislative branch, how has politics impacted the way we have fought wars over the years? Wow. First of all, Churchill said it best, you know, and I'll paraphrase, I won't get it right. There's nothing easy about democracy, but it beats the alternatives. And, you know, our form of government is such that military is always under civil authority, and it should be. That is the way our founding fathers devised it for the absolutely right reasons. My experience in LL, I used to tell, I got some bright people that would come and work for me. We had about, 150 folks that did legislative liaison stuff for the Air Force. And I said, gang, this is going to be it's like I said, you get a front row seat, okay, at this, how this branch works. It's like 9th grade civics, okay? Day to day, you get to really see how it works. But I have one caution. Don't let it jade you. Because politics is a nasty, nasty business. And it is often absolutely runs contrary to the mission that I'm in. I'm all about breaking glass and killing bad people when it's time to do that and providing national security. And it oftentimes gets off the course due to just nothing but bad politics. And it can be very discouraging. I would tell you, if some people in Congress had their way, we'd still be flying B-17s and F-86s, okay? Because they don't want to lose systems, and they'll hold on to things, and they'll slow down technology and advances. And you heard what I told you. We held the Department of Defense hostage, because our executive branch and our legislative branch could not figure out a way to balance spending okay, with reductions. So we took it away from the very people who are responsible to secure, ensure our security. Could not have been a bigger blunder. You can ask Justin the impact that had when he was a group commander on his ability to execute the mission for our nation. Get his perspective. When we grounded flying squadrons, we grounded them for 4 months. Don't get me started. Don't get me started.
Well, very good, General. We are at the top of the hour here. This has been a fascinating tour. Absolutely fascinating. So much to talk about. If you could be agreeable to, I'd love to take the rest of the questions and send them to you.
Yeah,
And
Tomas, you bet, sir. I mean, and frankly, if anyone, I can stay on, and those who want to leave can leave, or you can send me the questions and I'll peck away at them.
there's
some,
so many.
Can I tell you
there's
how,
so many of
Yeah.
them.
these are
Yeah.
phenomenal questions, by the way.
I'll send you the
Uh,
list of questions, General. And we can
Okay.
provide that along with the recording of this to our participants.
Yeah.
Can I answer
Look,
this one question? I
Sure.
just
I mean,
answered. It says, what
absolutely.
areas of
I
defense
think-
spending do you think are the most important to restoring the department's capability to better meet the threats of China and Russia? Okay, and I'm not being pejorative in this, and I know Justin will back me up. The existential threat that we face is China and Russia. It's not the Islamic extremists. It's painful. God forbid that we never want our homeland ever attacked again, like happened almost 20 years ago. But our existential capability to deter that threat is our strategic deterrence. And it's the importance of our nuclear enterprise. Flat out, period, dot. And we've allowed it to atrophy, and we are behind, and we have to modernize our air, land, and sea legs of the triad. That combined with our cyber and space is where those dollars need to go. Not all of them. We're still going to have to go around and do a lot of that peacekeeping, but we have to pay because we've lagged the fight in space and cyber, and we've allowed our strategic deterrence to atrophy. Did I answer your question? And I'm not alone in that. And it's not because I'm some nuclear zealot. In fact, I hate nuclear weapons more than anyone in the world. But I'm a realist. And we are not going to put that genie back into the bottle and sticking a flower in our gun barrels and saying, let's all get along, isn't going to work. I'm going to give you one thing I'll close on for those of you who want to know. In the last century, we had two major wars. Two major wars. We'll just concentrate on World War II. We'll never know the exact numbers, but it's estimated that between 60 and 85 million people died in World War II. That's 30,000 people a day, gang, if you want to do the math. And that was a world without nuclear weapons until the war ended in 1945. So the world has found plenty of ways to almost destroy itself without nuclear weapons. Since World War II, while there have been conflicts, while there have been wars, while there have been famines and tragedies, we have never remotely approached anything that we approached in World War I and World War II. So you can make the argument that our strong nuclear deterrence has done what it was intended to do, deter adversaries from taking away the life that we as Americans enjoy, and providing stability around the world. And if we disarmed our nuclear enterprise, a lot of our allies who rely on us, that nuclear umbrella, are going to develop. So we would just proliferate nuclear weapons if we don't maintain the capabilities we have. So I appreciate whoever asked that question. It was a fantastic question. Hey, gang, I wish you all the best. I hope this hit the mark, Tomas.
Absolutely, absolutely. So much to talk about. And we will collect the rest of the questions and send them to you. And we're going to have many other dialogues with you going forward. So absolutely terrific. Thank you so much. We have a small token of our appreciation for this, which Michelle is going to present and which going to send to you. Okay.
Yeah, we're going to have this delivered to your house.
We're going to have this delivered to your home. It's a globe with a little plaque of thank you for providing this lecture and celebrating the time today. And this was just terrific. And like I said, we look forward to many, many more conversations and things that we can do
Well,
together.
I appreciate it. Hey, Nicholas, I got your question. I'll send it an answer to you about Central and South America. You talked about the vacuum. Thank you, sir. Tomas, allow me to close with these two. First of all, thank you for a dumb fighter pilot. Your questions were far more provocative and intelligent than my presentation. So thank you for the quality of your questions. And second, I want to wish all of you happy holidays. We're going to get through this 2020 and get through these challenges, and we'll be stronger and better for it. Okay, so hang in there, everyone. We're counting on you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, General Rand, for your time.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.